Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Renu Tyagi from Sardar Patel Institute, Ahmedabad. Today we will study the module Variation in Respiratory Functions with Environment under the paper Physiology and Sports Anthropology. Now let's see what we are going to learn this from particular module. The learning objectives of this module are: number 1 is to study the respiratory system and its functioning. Number 2, we'll try and understand the mechanism of respiration, that is inspiration and expiration. How does it take place? Then we'll understand the various lung functions and their types like static or dynamic type of lung functions. Later on, we'll study the factors affecting the respiratory system. Then we'll try and understand how respiratory functions are affected by the environmental factors. Now let's understand what is the respiratory system of a human being. As we all know that respiratory system is meant for the respiration purpose of the body. The respiratory system is one of the major system of our body. The main function of this system is to exchange the gases between the organism and our surroundings or environment, and this could be done with the help of various type of organs associated with our respiratory system. What are the organs which are associated with our respiratory system? The major organs that constitute our respiratory system are: number 1, the major organs which include nose, mouth, larynx, pharynx, trachea, our lungs and bronchi. Then we have upper respiratory tract which includes the nose, nasal cavity, sinuses including the ethmoid, frontal, maxillary, sphenoid, and then larynx and the trachea. Then our lower respiratory tract constitutes of our lungs, bronchi and the bronchioles, and finally the alveoli or the air sacs. Now let's see what is the function of respiratory system. What else does it do in our body? Besides doing the gaseous exchange in our body with the surroundings, it helps in the cleaning of the air also that we breathe in. It's very important for the immunological functions in our body. It's very important for the temperature control in our body. One of the important function of our respiratory system is the vocalization. And finally, it's very important for the removal of the irritants in our body. Now let's understand the mechanism of respiration in our body. The respiratory system allows the gas exchange to breathe in the oxygen and exhale the carbon dioxide. The mechanism includes the external and internal respiration. What do we mean by the external respiration? It is the exchange of the gases between the body and the environment. Whereas the internal respiration can be defined as the exchange of the gases, namely oxygen and carbon dioxide, between the alveolar sac and the blood vessels. The oxygen enters through the nose and then it travels through the nasal cavity, thereby entering the trachea and reaching to bronchioles and finally to our lungs, where gaseous exchange takes place in the alveolar sac. This takes place because of the thin membrane of the alveolar sac, which can permit the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood capillaries and the alveolar sac. Once inside the blood capillaries, the oxygen attaches itself to the hemoglobin content of the red blood cells of the blood. Now let's understand the mechanism of respiration through this picture. In this pictorial representation, we can have a look at the total respiratory system, where we can see a conducting zone and a transitional and respiratory zone. The conducting zone includes the trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and the terminal bronchioles. The movement of air from the terminal bronchioles to the respiratory bronchioles is the transition phase from the conducting phase to the transitional or respiratory zone. In the respiratory zone, the air moves from the respiratory bronchioles to the alveolar duct and finally to the alveolar sac, where this exchange with the capillaries takes place, and hence the actual exchange of the gases is going on here. Let's understand the different type of respiratory diseases. What do we understand by the respiratory diseases? It is a medical term that encompasses the pathological condition affecting the organs and tissues that makes the gaseous exchange possible in higher organisms. The respiratory diseases range from the mild and the self-limiting, such as the common cold, pneumonia, pulmonary embolism, asthma, cystic fibrosis, emphysema, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, that is COPD, and sometimes even cancer. Now let's understand the respiratory diseases and to the part which they affect during the occurrence. The respiratory diseases might affect our upper respiratory tract. It may affect our trachea or bronchi. There are different diseases which influence our bronchioles, our alveoli pleura or pleural cavity. It might affect the nerves and the muscles of the breathing, thereby influencing the normal respiratory procedure in the body. The proper functioning of the respiratory system is measured with the help of different lung functions. The lung functions are described as the functional capacities of the lung. The different type of lung functions can be broadly categorized into two main groups, which is volume and the capacities. Those compartments of lungs which are non-overlapping are known as the lung volumes, such as the tidal volume, residual volume, etc. On the other hand, the overlapping compartments, which are due to the result of two or more volumes, are known as the lung capacities, such as vital capacity. Now let's understand the static lung functions. Static lung functions are the type of lung functions that are measured independent of time. The sum of lung functions which are static are residual volume, that is RV, and tidal volume, that is TV. Now let's define the residual volume. It may be defined as the volume of air remaining in the lungs at the end of a maximum expiration. And what is tidal volume? It may be defined as the volume of air that is taken in during the inspiration or out during the expiration in a single breath. Let's understand some more type of lung functions. For example, the inspired reserve volume. This may be defined as the maximum volume of air that could be inhaled from the end tidal inspiration. The next is the expiratory reserve volume, which can be defined as the maximum volume of air that could be exhaled from the end tidal expiration. The next lung function is the respiratory rate. It can be defined as the number of breathing cycles per minute. The minute ventilation is another lung function which can be defined as the volume of air inspired or expired in 1 minute during a normal respiration. The minute ventilation can be calculated as the product of tidal volume and respiratory rate. Now let's come to the capacities. The first one is the inspiratory capacities. It can be defined as the maximum volume of air that could be inhaled after normal exhalation. The inspiratory capacities IC is equal to the summation of tidal volume and inspiratory reserve volume. Some other static lung functions include the vital capacity. The vital capacity, that is VC, can be defined as the maximum volume of air that could be exhaled after maximum inspiration. Mathematically, it can be represented as that VC is equal to IC plus ERV, that is, it's the summation of inspiratory capacity and expiratory reserve volume. Then next, let's see what is functional residual capacity FRC. It can be defined as the volume of air remaining in the lungs by the end of a normal exhalation. So, FRC, it's the addition of expiratory reserve volume and the residual volume. The last static function which we have to study is the total lung capacity, which is defined as the maximum volume of air that the lungs could contain or they can hold. The total lung capacity is the addition of our vital capacity and the residual volume. Now let's come to the dynamic lung functions. What do we understand by the term dynamic lung functions? The dynamic lung functions are measured with respect to the time, and it is helpful in various changes in lung function with changes in the activity. The different type of dynamic lung functions are forced vital capacity, forced expiratory volume in 1 second, and the maximum voluntary ventilation. The forced vital capacity, that is FVC, may be defined as the maximum volume of air that could be exhaled as fast as possible after a maximal inspiration. Let's see what is forced expiratory volume in 1 second, that is FEV1. It can be defined as the maximum volume of air that could be exhaled by force in the first second after maximum inhalation. The maximum voluntary ventilation, that is MVV, may be defined as the greater amount of air that could be breathed per minute by breathing as deep and as fast as possible. This picture shows us the representation of different type of static lung functions on a graph. As we can see from this picture that all the static lung function, including the tidal volume, vital capacity, total lung capacity, residual volume, the inspiratory capacity, are clearly marked in this graph. Now let's have a look at the factors which influence our respiratory system and its functioning. The respiratory system is greatly affected by the environmental factors and hence bring the variation in our lung volumes and capacities and overall lung functioning. The major factor which influence our respiratory system are the ecological factors. And some of those ecological factors are the high temperature, colder temperature, high altitude, and the air pollution. Let's have a look how does temperature changes influence our respiratory system or its functioning. The people living in the warmer climate are generally leaner and taller. They have the more body surface area than their body mass ratio, and this helps in increasing the cooling mechanism of the body. So it's a sort of adaptation which our body takes place, or which our body adapts to the warmer areas. The people living in the warmer temperature tend to have a broad nose and short nasal canal, which is again an adaptive feature. So people living in such area have the higher respiratory rate, which further helps them in maintaining the core body temperature. Now let's see how our respiratory system gets adapted to the colder areas. The people living in the colder areas have long and narrow nasal apparatus. This is again an adaptive feature as the air outside is colder, and if this colder air is inhaled by the individual, this could be harmful for the lungs. So the long and the narrow nose helps to warm the air before it reaches to our lungs. Now let's see how our respiratory system get adapted to the higher altitude, or the people living in the higher altitude. The people living in the higher altitude acclimatize to the environment by having a barrel shaped chest, and this shape of chest helps to increase the lung volume. An increase in the alveoli and capillary area leads to an increase in the lung volume, so that they can inhale a larger volume of airs at the higher altitude where there is a lower atmospheric pressure. On the contrary, the people who live on the lowland areas or the plains, when reaches the highland areas, then acclimatization occurs because they have to adapt themselves to the higher altitude. And this takes place in the form of increase in their respiratory rate and an increase in the lung volumes, which helps them to increase the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli and the arteries. Let's understand the different terms associated with the changes in our respiratory functions. One of the most important is the adaptation. A person gets adapted to a particular type of environment, and those adaptations are taken over by the different parts of our respiratory system. The adaptation can be defined as the biological changes effected by the evolution to accommodate the population to different environmental conditions. It helps the individual to adjust himself or herself to the changing environment. Adaptation of the individual to the changes in the environment is very important, as the susceptibility of the individual depends on how far he or she could have a normal respiratory function. So, adaptability is the range of physiological and behavioral responses that an individual can make to adjust to environmental changes. Let's understand the different adaptive responses due to the change in the environment. The number one is the acclimatization. It is a term which helps us to study the physiological adaptation that may have some morphological effect, but which occurs during the lifetime of an individual and which is not passed on genetically to the next generation. What do we understand by the term acclimation? Acclimation may be a short-term physiological adaptation occurring over a period of several hours to several days. For example, the tanning due to the sun exposure. What is habituation? Habituation is the neurophysiological mechanism for tuning out the unwanted stimuli. That is an accommodation that takes only a few minutes. Now let's study the difference in morphological features due to the change in environmental condition. This table clearly shows us the changes in the body forms due to the change in temperature. For instance, we can see that at higher temperature, an individual has a broad and short nose length. They have a broader nose with a short nose length. Besides, their body size is also short and they are thin in body size. Their skin color is generally dark. On the contrary, the people who are living in the colder climate have a narrow nose and they have a long nose length. Their body size is large and plump and their skin color is generally lighter. The people who are living in the warm climate have the sweating mechanism to cool the body and thereby maintaining their body temperature. The people in such areas have higher respiratory rate, which increases the blood flow to their skin and thereby it helps in maintaining the core body temperature. This mechanism is quite helpful in the warm and less humid areas. This pictorial representation shows us the adaptation due to the high temperature. The respiratory rate, as we have already seen, that it increases with the change in temperature or with the increase in the temperature. This further induces a blood flow or more blood flow to the epidermis. Thereby, there is an increase in the production of the sweat and there is more sweat, thereby more cooling effect on the body and hence the body temperature is maintained. This picture shows us the acclimatization of the natives of the high altitude and the low altitude. As we can clearly see from this picture that the various adaptive responses of the people staying in the high altitude are that there is an increase in the lung volume which leads to the increase in alveolar and capillary areas. Thereby, there is an increase in the pulmonary and diffusion capacity. Likewise, in the people of lowland natives, there is an increase in the respiratory rate and depth of the pulmonary ventilation. The different kind of adaptive responses at different altitudes finally leads to the adaptive result that there is an increase in the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli and the arteries. So, this is how the adaptive responses to the different altitudes are different, which results to the our acclimatization to that particular kind of altitude. This also shows us the acclimatization to the high altitude and how does it bring the adaptive responses in our respiratory system. This picture clearly shows us that the adaptive responses include an increase in the RBCs, hemoglobin and the hematocrit. Besides, there is an increase in the capillarization. The increase in capillarization leads to the decrease in the intercapillary distance. And the increase in RBCs and hemoglobin leads to the increase in blood oxygen carrying capacity. Both these adaptive responses finally lead to the increase in delivery of the oxygen to the tissues and to the cell mitochondria. Hence, the individual gets finally acclimatized to the high altitude with these adaptive changes in their respiratory system. Air pollution today is an important factor which has vast effect on respiratory function. The air pollution is caused by the introduction of the air pollutants like particulates, biological molecules or other harmful material into the Earth's atmosphere that cause possible diseases or deaths to human and damage to the other living organisms. Basically, the pollutants can be divided in two broad categories, that is the primary air pollutants or the secondary air pollutants. Primary air pollutants, they are the harmful substance that is emitted directly into the atmosphere. On the other hand, the secondary air pollutants are defined as the harmful substance formed in the atmosphere when a primary air pollutant reacts with the substances normally found in the atmosphere or with other air pollutants. For example, the H2O2 and HNO3, etc. The air pollutants can be further categorized into two types, that is outdoor air pollutants or indoor air pollutants. The outdoor air pollutants include the natural and man-made sources or oxides of sulfur and nitrogen from volcanoes, oceans, biological decay, etc. And the man-made sources include the power station, industries and road vehicles, etc. Some of the indoor air pollutants are quite greater than the outdoor pollutants. The most common indoor air pollutants are radon, cigarette smoke, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, formaldehyde pesticides, lead, cleaning solvents, ozone and asbestos. This table shows us the major air pollutants. From the picture, we can clearly make out the different kind of air pollutants, their chemical composition or their categorization, whether they are primary or the secondary air pollutant with the specific characteristics of the each air pollutant. Now let's have a look at the different health effect of the air pollution. The air pollution is associated with numerous effects on human health, including the pulmonary, cardiac, vascular and neurological impairments. The health effects vary greatly from person to person. The high-risk group such as the elderly, infants, pregnant women and sufferers from chronic heart and lung diseases are more susceptible to the air pollution. The children and elderly people are at a greater risk because children are generally more active outdoors and their lungs are still developing and they inhale more gas per kg, and elderly lose their alveolar elasticity with the age. The exposure to the air pollution can cause both acute, which is a short-term effect, or chronic, which is a long-term health effect. This shows us a pictorial representation of the stages of growth along with the change in the respiratory functions in the different age group and the impact of the air pollution on the lungs. As we can see from this picture that the infants or their toddlers are more prone to have the respiratory symptoms and the illnesses. And as an individual grow at an adult stage, they have the more influence of the air pollution resulting into the chronic cough or bronchitis or their reduced lung functions and wheezing, asthmatic attacks or different respiratory system related allergies. This table shows us the changes in our respiratory functions with the kind of different air pollutants. The table shows us that with an exposure to the pollutant like ozone or nitrogen dioxide or particulate matter or sulfur dioxide, there is an increased prevalence of respiratory symptoms or bronchial hyperresponsiveness. Besides, there is an increase in the cardiorespiratory and respiratory problems, thereby influencing our lung functions which keeps on declining due to our exposure to these air pollutants. The both gaseous and particulate air pollutants could have negative effect on the lungs. The solid particles could settle on the walls of our respiratory system, that is trachea, bronchi and bronchioles, and thereby causing the obstruction in the airways. These cause the reduction in lung volumes and lung capacities are affected. A continuous breathing of the polluted air could slow the normal cleansing action of the lungs, and this could result in the more particles reaching the lower portion of the lungs, thereby reducing our lung capacities. The particulate matters have some severe effect on the human body by harming the respiratory system. Thousands of different solid or liquid particles suspended in the air, including the soil particles, soot, lead, asbestos, sea salt, and sulfur acid droplets, are dangerous for two reasons, as it may contain the material with toxic or carcinogenic effect. And extreme small particles could become lodged in lungs and thereby cause the reduction in the lung functions. This table shows us the influence of different lung functions and different environmental conditions. For instance, among the highlanders, the tidal volume increases, whereas among the lowlanders, the tidal volume decreases. The tidal volume in the warmer climate also increases, but the air pollution effect also declines the tidal volume. So, this table clearly shows us the impact of the change in environment or our exposure to the air pollution and the consequent effect on our different lung functions. Now, let's summarize what we have learned in this module of respiratory system and the variation in the lung functions. It is one of the important system, that is our respiratory system, which help in the exchange of gases within the body and with the environment. As we know, we take oxygen and then we give out the carbon dioxide during the respiratory process. So, our respiratory system maintain a balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the body. And we have studied so far that the major body parts which are involved with the respiratory system or which make up our respiratory system starts from nose, goes to nasal canal, then larynx, then pharynx, then trachea, then it leads to the bronchioles and lungs, and finally the alveolar sacs. The alveolar sacs are the ultimate air exchange parts of the respiratory system. Now we have studied the different lung capacities also, and we have studied the different factors which influence our respiratory system and the lung volumes and lung capacities. Out of all the studies, lung volumes and lung capacities, the total lung capacity mostly remains same in the adults, unless the lining of our lungs, the internal linings of our lungs, are obstructed by some particular matter or other chemical substances like the smoke or similar material. The other lung functions generally reduce as the body gets exposed to the air pollutants. So, air pollution is a major threat to our lung system. A reduction in the lung function cause various respiratory and associated cardiorespiratory problems. So, those levels of the air pollutants need to be controlled to a great extent. And we have also learned that the ecology is the major factor which brings the variation in our lung functions. And what are those environmental or ecological factors? The major two are the temperature and the altitude. They are the major ecological factors which influence the variation or brings about the variation in our lung functions. And due to those changes in temperature and changes in the altitude from lower to the high altitude, or the people from high to low altitude, similarly people who are living in the warmer climate or people who are living in the colder climate have acclimatized themselves to the particular environment. These acclimatization results in the proper adjustment to the ecological environment the person is staying in. Adaptation, acclimatization and acclimation results in the change in the physiological activities and cause the or brings the changes in the respiratory functions accordingly. And out of all those ecological factors, we have learned that pollution is the major threat or is the root cause of several cardiorespiratory and respiratory diseases among the human beings. As we have studied so far, that it may cause several ill effects on the human body, but the extent of the effect depends on the physical fitness of an individual. The physical fitness of an individual depends on the way one adapts to that environment and the changes in the respiratory functions, which ultimately helps the individual to adjust their body as per the environment. Thank you.